Even though the tendency system is far from perfect in 2K, it's probably my favorite part of making caps because it allows you to really make the players play differently out there on the court. So for anyone that's older like I am, way back in the day when it was just NBA Live and even before the predecessor version of NBA Live, basically you had different height guys that looked slightly differently, but they were just all basically the same player running around out there on the same AI code doing the same things. You didn't have any real differentiation. So with the tendencies, if you really work with the tendencies when you're creating a player or if you're editing a roster, you can really get these guys playing differently out there, the AI controlled players. But there's a lot of misconceptions about some of the tendencies, which is understandable because 2K doesn't really explain them very much. They have very short names. You take it at face value, you think it means what it looks like it says, and every once in a while a developer will post a blog or post on a forum somewhere and explain some of these tendencies. But there's also just been a lot of discussion and speculation on tendencies throughout the years, and I see videos and forum posts that just have some of these wrong, which again is understandable because 2K doesn't really do a really good job of explaining these things and giving clear definitions of what some of these are. So I'm just going to go through some of the ones that just to sort of keep an eye out. These are the ones that people most often get confused about or misunderstand. And when you're creating a player or you're doing a custom roster or something like that, just sort of keeping an eye on these things, these particular ones can help make a big difference when you're creating your players. Because if you really want to test the tendencies, you have to run a lot of games and just let the AI play itself out and just let the games run and observe and watch and then tweak tendencies, and it can be very tedious. So I'm not really going to cover anything that's self-explanatory on these, but the first big misconception is on the left, middle, and right ones. Shot close, left, middle, and right. Mid-range, shot left, left center, center right, mid-right, and the same with the three-point shot. None of those affect the actual AI gameplay. Those are only used in the simulation games. There's been a lot of back and forth talk over the years on this, but I pulled, just to confirm it, I pulled a developer post in the forums from September 2022, so fairly recently, that confirmed, and the developer confirmed with the tendency engineer that those are only for the simulation. This developer is involved in programming the AI and confirmed that those left, center, right numbers have no involvement whatsoever in the AI gameplay. So I don't know exactly what they do in the simulation. There was some speculation that it was basically just to make the shot charts look correct, but that there was no real explanation of how they affect the simulation, but they definitely do not affect the gameplay. So if you want to mess with those for simulation, this is not how often the player shoots. It's not that he shoots 25% of the time from close left. It's a comparison. So these three numbers are a comparison. So you can either do them out of 100, like I have here. So it will be most likely he would shoot close middle as far as the simulation. But you can sometimes you also see them with lower numbers. So if this was a 3 and this was a 5 and this was a 2, he'd still shoot. It's still a proportionate comparison, and he'd still shoot close middle more often than the other two. So you can do it either way. It probably doesn't make a huge difference in the simulated gameplay. It definitely does not affect the AI if you're playing out the game. So along with that, the other one that was added a few years back were these spot up shot mid-range, off-screen shot mid-range, spot up shot 3, off-screen shot 3, and then there's also a corresponding rating, which is spot-up drive and off-screen drive. So these shot and drive ratings for spot-up situations and off-screen, they interact. So there was a developer blog on this back in 2018 when these ratings were added, or these tendencies were added. And so basically these are situational. So whereas these are more general tendencies to shoot close or to shoot from mid-range or to shoot from three-point range, and those will definitely affect your AI gameplay. If this is 0, this guy's just really not going to take many three-point shots at all, if at all, in the game. And you will see sometimes in the 2K rosters, they'll have a guy who was one of the top 5 three-point shooters in the league, and he'll have basically a 0 or a 5 as his shot 3, and then you'll realize that's why the guy's never taking any three-point shots in your games. So those you definitely want to set, and those are more general situations, but these are specific. So basically, as the developer blog explained, if it's a spot up, it's not how often they're going to spot up and shoot from mid-range. It's not that, he's going to more often shoot off-screen mid-range shots than spot up. These correspond specifically to the drive tendency. So the spot up mid-range means if he's in a spot up situation, basically, he catches it, he's somewhat uncovered, he's got an open shot in the mid-range area. I've got that set at a 65. So the game's going to look, the engine is going to look at this number, this 42, and so basically it's going to be a 65 for shooting the shot from the spot up mid-range versus a 42 for driving. So he's going to be much more likely to take the shot in that spot up situation than drive to the basket. And this is my Reggie Miller cap, so obviously Reggie Miller's going to be much more likely to shoot a wide open shot than just to take it and drive to the basket. So the same thing with the off-screen situation. I've got that at a 46, and so his off-screen shot mid-range I have at a 69, obviously much higher again. So if he comes off a screen in mid-range and he's open, he's going to be much more likely to shoot it than to just take it and drive to the basket. And the same thing works with the three-pointers. You see I have him even higher here. So if Reggie Miller's standing behind the three-point line wide open and someone passes on the ball, that 75 is going to kick in versus the spot up drive of 42. So he's going to be much more likely to take a 3. And if you're playing games and testing this out, if you put them fairly close, like if you put them at 50-50 or 40-40 or 60-60, whatever it is, then there's basically going to be a 50-50 chance in that situation they would shoot versus drive. Now, if you keep these lower, though, they're not going to shoot or drive as much. They might just end up passing the ball or holding it or whatever. So for these, if you have them if I have them at 80 and 40, he's going to be taking a lot of three-point shots at 80. If I have it at 30 and 15, even though the three-pointers are double the driving, it's still a much lower number, and it's not going to happen quite as often. So generally, you want to compare these two numbers, and you want to have your guys set up if you want more of a driver or a shooter. But also, like, for example, if it was your center, you're not going to have them at an 80 on probably either of these. He's not really going to drive or shoot from the three-point line. So you also want to keep them somewhat proportionate to like what type of player it is. So I generally try and keep these somewhat close to the three-point shot. So normally I have him at a 70 three-point shot, but if he comes off of a screen open or he's in a spot-up standstill shot open, he's going to shoot threes a little bit more often than he would in just normal situations. So you want to kind of keep both those things in mind for the spot-up and the off-screen shots. The rest of those are all pretty self-explanatory ones. Another one that is most people know about this by now, but another one that is kind of easy to misunderstand is the crash. For years, I thought this meant like crash the boards, particularly because it's right after the putback. But no, it means how often the player actually crashes when they're going to the basket for a layup or a dunk. Meaning they've crashed into another player, or the situations where you'll see them just sort of fall on the floor and flail around, and everyone else goes back down the fast break, and they're still trying to get up. So generally, you want to keep this. You don't want anything really high on this, but generally, like your post players, your big guys, Wilt Chamberlain's not going to get knocked down a lot, so you want him down in single digits, maybe at 5 or something like that. I generally try and keep everybody under. I generally don't go above 30 on this. You do get some guys, like I have Reggie Miller at 28. Guys like Allen Iverson and Reggie Miller who are driving to the basket, drawing a lot of fouls, always seem to be on the ground. I tend to kind of keep them a little bit higher, but it doesn't really come up all that often. If you start putting it up really high, I'm sure you'd see it a lot more. But basically, it just means that the likelihood they're going to end up on the ground when they go to the basket. Instead of crash the actual boards or anything like that. The rest of those are self-explanatory ones. These triple threat, basically, these are all kind of competing against each other. So, like here, Reggie's going to be most often, he's going to jab step, and if he's in a triple threat position with the ball, next highest would be shoot. So, like, if you have a big guy who's really not going to be doing a lot of pump faking and jab stepping or taking a lot of perimeter shots, you're really going to want his idle up pretty high. So basically, he's just going to sort of hold the ball when he's on the outside. He's not really going to do much with it. He'll pass it or whatever, but he's not going to make a lot of moves or anything like that. But you will see sort of, however you set these numbers up, you will see the guys sort of play, those animations sort of play out when you're watching. In the setup, these all sort of compete against each other too. No setup dribble just means he's going to take a dribble. What's the chance he's going to take a dribble without making one of these two moves, the size up or the hesitation? So generally, you want these fairly high. It depends. These, when you're dealing with more of the classic players, guys weren't really dribbling all over the place before they've made any moves to the basket. Coaches didn't really allow them to do a lot of that kind of stuff. So with the older players, I tend to keep these up up higher. With the younger or newer players, you probably want this a little bit lower so that they're making more moves. With the post players, you want this up to like 99. For Moses Malone, he's not going to be doing hesitation moves or size ups out on the perimeter. And then these, you just sort of, put whichever one higher you want more to happen more often. If you want it more often using the hesitation move or the size up, whichever one you want more often, you put that one higher. But we already talked about the spot drive and the off-screen drive. Drive right, that's basically, obviously going to the right. So if you have a lefty player, especially one who drives a lot to the left, then you want this lower. So basically, if I had a left-handed player that went left a lot, I would have this down something like 39 or 40 or something like that. You generally don't want to make it too far. So basically this is, almost consider it like a 50. The 50 mark is the cutoff. If it's below 50, they're going to more often drive left. If it's 50 or higher, they're going to more often drive right. If it's a big post player, again, like Moses Malone, I might put him up to 70 or 75 because he's not really going to drive left very often. The rest of those are all kind of self-explanatory. Driving in and out, that's, think John Stockton, Steve Nash, your point guard who drives under the basket and then doesn't end up shooting, but ends up, driving and breaking down the defense and then coming back out. So if it's somebody who's generally, when they're driving, they're going to go to the basket and take it to the basket, you want to keep that number low. If it's more of like a John Stockton or a Steve Nash or somebody like that, or a Jason Williams, that's going to be more of a passer, then you might want that a little bit higher. Well, you probably definitely want that a little bit higher so that they're driving to break down the defense, but then they're they're kicking, driving out to the baseline or something, and then maybe kicking it out to the 3-point line. No driving dribble move works sort of like the no setup dribble. So that's basically how the rating to check for them making a dribble move without going to the basket. So basically, your guys that spend more time dribbling around the perimeter, you want this lower. Your guys who, like, say, a Michael Jordan who attacks the basket more, you might want this a little bit higher so that he's attacking the basket rather than just sort of dribbling around the perimeter. With your post players, that's going to be a setting that is going to be different for a post player than a perimeter player. The post players you don't have to worry about too much because most of these moves are going to be pretty low. You're not going to have Kareem Abdul-Jabbar doing a bunch of double crossovers or half spins. So they're probably not going to have a lot of driving moves available anyway. The ditch to open man, this one really affects the sim a lot. So if you're trying to get your guys certain assist numbers, you will definitely notice this. When I did a custom roster for 2K22, I was working on an 84-85 custom roster, trying to get Magic Johnson and guys like that really, and Isaiah Thomas, really high assist numbers. And this would affect that the most. So it'll still affect it in the AI gameplay, but it pretty much in the simulated gameplay, this is the main number that affects the assist totals. That's the main way to sort of tweak the assist totals. The post up, this one's actually pretty important for just sort of stylistic gameplay. If you have a guy who, obviously your guards are going to have low post up, but if you have a post player, or I shouldn't say a post player, but a big guy who plays outside more, like maybe nowadays everybody plays outside. There's hardly any real post players anymore. But for the older teams, you have guys like Kevin McHale or Chris Webber who played a lot from the free throw line, and they faced up more from the free throw line than just back to the basket posting. Or you have a guy like Kurt Rambis, who he was at the free throw line a lot, not because anyone wanted to get him the ball at the free throw line, but because you had Kareem and Worthy and also Magic Johnson, who all played in the low post and posted up and took the ball into the basket. And so basically they just wanted Kurt Rambis out of the way. So if you tweak this will affect how often those guys go into the post. So the guards you don't really have to worry about, and the perimeter players, because when the play is set up, they're generally going to be on the perimeter anyway. But with the older playbooks especially, where they have the two double post players, if you want a guy like a McHale or Chris Webber or Rambis or somebody spotting up more at the free throw line than down under the basket, then you want to keep this lower. Generally for post players, I mean, guys like, Moses Malone or Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, I'm going to have this up at, something like 85 or maybe even higher, maybe even 90 for those guys. Somebody like Dr. J, who would go down into the low post but wasn't there all the time, like especially your small forwards, I might have this at 40, so that he's getting down in the post sometimes, but he's facing up more. But then if you have a post player that you want on the free throw line more than you want down the low block, then you just keep lowering this number down further. And if you do have guards that you want to go down in the post, then you would raise this up. Like if I have Magic Johnson and I want him posting up more often, it's not going to happen as much because he's the point guard, so a lot of times he's going to be initiating the play, but I would raise this up higher if I wanted a guard down in the post more often. And then these will be once the player actually gets the ball down in the post. So shot from post, that'll have some impact. I mean, if you have a guy who has a high post up and he's always down in the post, but you leave this low, he's going to get the ball down there a lot, but he's not going to shoot a lot. So if you obviously want to adjust this. Your guards and players who go down the post less often, it's not going to be nearly as high, but if you do want the guy to actually shoot out of the post, you've got to have some decent amount on this number. Another area that gets commonly misconceived is the post hook right, or sorry, post hook left, post hook right, post fade left, post fade right. Some people think, oh, 2K just has for years has had these numbers flip-flopped wrong. But actually it's just, the fact is, and that's easy to see just from, if you look at it, that's what you would think. Oh, post hook left, that means he's shooting with his left hand. Post hook right means he's doing a hook shot with his right hand. But that's not actually what it means. Here I don't have it. Reggie Miller's not going to be shooting a lot of post hooks, so I don't have that down there. But if I had this here and this here, what this means is actually the player's turning to the left. So think of it as the shoulder. So basically he's going towards his left shoulder, he's turning towards the left, which means it's a hook shot with the right hand. And this, the opposite, means the player is going towards his right, which if you're facing with your back to the basket and you're going towards your right, that's a left hook. So Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, he's going to have his post hook left really high because he shot most of his hook shots right with his right hand. If it's a left-handed player, then you're going to want to have the post hook right higher. And it's the same thing with the post fade left and right. It doesn't mean you got to think again, the player, this is a post player with the ball, they've got their back to the basket. So when a post player fades to their left with their back to the basket, that's a shot with their right hand. And same thing here with the post fade right, the player's fading is going towards their right shoulder, going towards the right, facing away from the basket, which means that's going to end up being a shot. Well, if you're a right-handed player, it's going to be your more typical fadeaway type shot. You don't get as many. Usually you fade away opposite of or basically towards your strong hand, mainly because that you can get the most separation and protection with your elbow as you're shooting. You can kind of clear some space for yourself. If you turn the other way, you're basically exposing the ball to the defender. Like if you're a right-handed shooter, you would be exposing the ball to the defender. Some guys do it, and some guys do it very successfully, but it's just easier to protect the ball going the other way. So this would be facing away from the basket. They're going towards their right shoulder. So your right-handed players are going to have your post hook left higher and your post fade right higher. And your left-handed players are going to have the post hook right higher and your post fade left higher. Now that's just in general. Obviously there's some guys that, there might be some unique guy that likes to go the opposite direction more often, or he's righty but he likes to shoot left-handed hooks. And then generally, these are, if you have a guy at 80 and 75 versus 10 and 5, even though it's a difference of 5 each way, there's also the overall numbers important here too. So that's why I like, with Reggie Miller, I had him down at 0. So basically he wouldn't take any post hooks anyway. Same thing with fadeaways. The guys that takes a lot more fadeaways, you're going to want both those numbers up higher. But that's basically how those work. The rest, these are all once the guy's got the ball in there. Some of these will happen anyway, like I think drop step. There's pretty much always a chance there might be a drop step. That's sort of a basic move. But if you want a guy who, I was just doing a cap yesterday of Andrew Bynum, and this was like, I did it as like a 2011 Bynum with the Lakers when he just had that killer season after he came back from that injury, and he was averaging about 19 a game. If you just watch the highlights from that season, he's just getting the ball in the post and just killing people. He's just dunking on them left and right, and it's just drop stepping, and he put on some weight at that point. He was pretty big and pretty bulky, and nobody could just stop him. He was just drop stepping on people left and right and just dunking on them. So somebody like that, if I really want him to just drop step a lot, I might, in the post, a big player, I might have him up at something like that. generally, the other ones, it depends on if you're doing more modern players or if these are older classic players. You're generally not going to have any of these really high. I mean, especially like in the 80s, guys weren't taking a lot of post hop shots or step backs. If you're doing a more modern roster, then some of these are going to be much higher than you probably won't even see as many drop steps these days. You see more hop shots and step backs. So up and under is another one that you will see a difference on that. Like if you jack this number up, there's some guys who just have really good, up and under moves. They can get those little kind of head fakes and get the guy up and then step under him. So that's one sometimes too. I'll kick up if it's a guy who just was really good around the basket with those sort of those head fakes. Shot. Now you'll notice at the top it says Tendencies Freelance. So this is not. This is when the offense is freelancing. So they're not when they're running a play. So with the AI, you'll notice, they'll try and run plays, but sometimes those plays will break down. And so this would be, I believe this impacts shot in the simulation, and it also impacts the amount of shots in the game AI gameplay. But in the AI gameplay, it's only when the play breaks down and they're in a freelance mode. So obviously you want the guys you want to shoot more, you want this number higher. Keep in mind, it's going to depend on who's on the floor with them. So if you have everybody at 90, then it's not really going to matter because they're all going to basically be the same. So you want to try and stagger these depending on, who you want to shoot the ball more. I have Reggie Miller at 88. Reggie wasn't a 30-point-a-game scorer, so I don't have him. If he was Allen Iverson, then I'd have this at like 96 or 7 or 98. If it's I was doing a capitation on Prince the other day. He never really averaged more than about 13 or 14 points a game. So I put him down. I'll put him down somewhere in here in low 70s or something like that. If it's a bench scrub who doesn't really play, he's just out there banging and drawing fouls and stuff like that. You might have him down somewhere down in there. Touches. This one's pretty important. It basically, again, it's not when a play is running, it's going to be in freelance, but that's going to happen a lot with the computer because the plays are just going to kind of break down and nobody's going to shoot. And then they'll just sort of start freelancing. But with the touches, it's going to be how often just, they touch the ball. Basically, the ball is going to get to them. Now, if it's a point guard, I generally don't keep the point guards any higher than about 65 or 70 because they're already initiating the play, so they're always involved in the offense. This is more important for if you have a post player, like say a Chris Webber, who they ran the Kings back in the days with that team with Chris Webber. They put him on the free throw line, the high post, and they ran the offense through him. He was a great passer, and they ran the entire offense through him. So for a guy like that, you're going to want to really jack his touches up because he's not going to be bringing the ball up the court. So for him to get the ball, when that play breaks down, usually it's going to break down on the perimeter, and so you're going to need the touches high so that he actually gets involved and they get the ball to him. And if it's somebody else who, like a Reggie Miller, I would have his touches higher than the point guard. Again, he's not going to touch the ball more than the point guard, but the point guard is going to naturally already have the ball more often from running the plays. So you don't really need to force the ball to the point guard. So like even a Magic Johnson or Isaiah Thomas, I'm not going to have this higher than 65 or 70 because they're going to be touching the ball all the time anyway. And it's really the shooting guards and the small forwards. You need their touches up higher because you need them to get the ball to them. Now, Reggie Miller, I have at 81 because, again, he generally didn't average more than about 18 or 19 points a game. He was a great scorer, but he was not a volume shooter, except, occasionally he was, but overall he wasn't really. So, but you kind of get a sense of this when you're playing too, because again, it depends on who the other four guys are on the court and what their tendencies are. But these are numbers like these two numbers. I end up tweaking a lot, just kind of how when I see how things play out. Roll versus pop. This is another one that's misunderstood. Whereas dribble, and again, it's totally understandable because they just don't do a good job of explaining this. So drive right, this is like a slider. The further you go, the higher you go, the more often they're going to drive right, which means the lower you go, the more often they're going to drive left. And they're basically a 50-point cutoff. However, roll versus pop, even though this looks like this, and this one does not say it's a slider. I mean, it just says drive right. Doesn't say anything about left. This actually looks like it should be a slider, roll versus pop, but it's not a slider. This is basically how often they will roll. And the lower you put it, that makes it the more often they will pop. So if I have it at 0, which I have for Reggie Miller, he's not going to roll. So if he sets a pick, and this is off of a pick, so if he sets a pick, he's never going to roll to the basket. He's always going to pop out for the shot. If it's a post player, if it's Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, you'll see he's going to be, or Shaq or Moses Malone, they're going to be set at 99 because they're always going to roll. So really what you want to think of this is how often they roll. And if they get, and the less often they roll, that means instead of rolling, they're going to be popping. So you want all your guys, you want popping at 0 or 1 or something low, 5. You want, sometimes with the guards, especially in the 80s and 90s, they didn't always just go out to the three-point line. They rarely took three-pointers. So a lot of those guys will have it 10 or 15 or 20 because they would roll to the basket still because it was much more common back then. But your post players like, your Shaqs, your Kareems, your Moses Malone, Ralph Sampson, those guys didn't really pop. Maybe a Ewing or Olajuwon, they might kick out to the baseline because they were good baseline shooters. So, I might have them at 85 or something like that because maybe occasionally they will pop out for a mid-range shot. Transition spot up, which it doesn't say it here, but this one is similar to roll versus pop. This is transition spot up versus cut, even though it doesn't say versus cut. So it means how often they're going to, on the transition, they're going to spot up at the three-point line versus continuing to cut to the basket. So this one I have a 55 for Reggie because, again, back when he played, everyone wasn't playing 5 out and taking 53. Teams weren't taking 53 pointers a game. So guys back then, even a great shooter like Reggie, still would keep going, cut to the basket on a fast break for a dunk or a layup. So I have him at 55 for spot up. But anybody nowadays that, a lot of these shooters that, all they do is shoot. Steph Curry, you're probably going to have him, Steph Curry at, 99 spot up transition because he's just always going to run to the three-point line. Your post players, you're going to have down here at 0 or 1 or something like that. I've heard people say like if you put these at 0 that it will cause problems. I've never seen anything like that. I'm sure at some point maybe there was a bug that caused something like that, but if you're worried about that, just put it at 1. But I don't see that being a problem. The ISOs, this is another one that there's a little bit of an under the radar tip on this one. So this is pretty clear, it's isolations versus elite defenders, good defenders, average, poor. In that blog, developer blog from 2018, when these were actually added, the developer explained what the purpose of these were and how they worked. And it's basically, and I'll just, it's Reggie Miller cap here, so I'll just use Reggie as an example. This is how often in these scenarios where the defender is either, elite, good, average, or poor, that Reggie would, if he gets the ball and he's matched up against one of those guys, it's how often he's going to say, I can just take this guy. So with the isolation poor defender, that means there's a pretty good chance, regardless of what play is called, and again, this is all the AI doing this, not, obviously you could do whatever you want if you're controlling him, but if the AI you're playing the AI team, 58, that means it's how likely, it's not a 58% chance, but the rating, the 58 rating goes towards how likely it is that if there's you have a poor defender guy matched up on Reggie, he's going to say, screw the play, I'm just taking this guy. And so generally you want these just like they sound. It's how often you want a guy trying to ISO an elite defender versus a good versus average or a poor. The worst, if a guy is just the 10th man off the bench and you don't really want him shooting, you might have these all at 0 because you don't really want him ISOing anybody. But again, this isn't how often they're going to call an ISO for Reggie, or how often he's just going to ISO in general. It's specifically triggered in the AI that when he gets the ball, there's basically a check for him to say, do I think I can just take this guy? And so obviously if it's an elite defender, it's going to be much less likely, well, as long as you have the rating set up correctly, it's going to be much less likely he's going to try and just take the elite defender. So if Ron Artest is guarding him, it's going to be much less a chance he's going to try and take that guy than if it's just some guy that just got called up from the G League that shouldn't even be out there on the court against Reggie Miller. Then he's going to have a much higher chance that Reggie's going to say, I can just take this guy. I don't care what play the team just called. I'm just going to take the guy. Now the trick here though is we always think of ISOs on the perimeter, right? You're just dribbling and you're taking the guy one-on-one. But in this developer blog, as they explain, they didn't want to leave out the post players, so this also works for the post players. So this means that if the guy's in the post and he gets the ball, how likely is he to just try and take the guy in the post and just bypass the play and just take it himself? And so it depends on which guy is matched up on him there in the post. So there was my best friend and I tried to play a custom league a couple years ago, and we had just did this big fantasy draft. We had a bunch of classic players in there, and we noticed Wilt Chamberlain wasn't even in the top. I don't even think he was in the top 30 in scoring in the league at some point, and we couldn't figure out why Wilt Chamberlain's scoring was so low. And then I went in and looked at his tendencies, and basically all his ISO tendencies were down to almost nothing. And so he would never just take guys one-on-one. He would just keep running the play because his ISO tendencies were down. So it's not just the perimeter ISOs, it's also the post player ISOs too. So if you have a Wilt Chamberlain, a Shaq, a Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, you're going to want high ISO numbers for those guys too, because when they get the ball in the post, especially against a weaker defender, then they're just going to want to take that guy instead of kicking the ball out or continuing to run the play. Now play discipline also kind of plays into that. It's similar. It's sort of an individual decision making for the guy, and it means how likely is the person, if the play is running, and Reggie Miller gets the ball, it's how likely is he to continue running the play versus just taking a shot. Now this is different than him saying he thinks he can just take his particular defender. This is just in general, he just wants to get a shot up versus just running the play. So for Reggie, I have him at 2 play discipline because he's going to be much more likely to just freelance. And so this where it's kind of confusing because it says tendencies freelance. This part of it doesn't mean that that a freelance is running or the team is running freelance. This part means basically that the player is going to break off the play and go freelance on his own. And so that's on the ISO part, and the same thing with the play discipline. This is just based on matched up against a specific defender. This is just more also sort of a general check as to how often the guy's going to just say, I don't care about your play, I'm going to go get a shot for myself. So obviously, like if it's a bench guy that doesn't really shoot and averages a point and a half a game, you want him at 99 play discipline. You don't want him ever trying to just go off on his own and freelance. You just want him running the play. Your high scorers, your Allen Iversons, your Reggie Millers, Ray Allens, you don't want those guys. Well, maybe not Ray Allen, because Ray Allen was more in the structure of the play. He was getting guys; they were having to get him open for spot up shots. But like Allen Iverson, you're going to want low play discipline, so that basically he's going to be more likely to just take matters into his own hands. So the defense ones, these are all pretty self-explanatory. We don't have the problem anymore, but in 2K22, the block shots were crazy. It was, you run a game with 5-minute quarters and teams were getting 15 block shots and things like that. And so I had to drop all the block shot tendencies down across the board. And that did make a difference. I mean, they did the shot, they were still getting 5, 6, 7 block shots a game, but not as much as, 12 or 13 or 14 or 15. So even if you have a good shot blocker, if you have this too low, they're going to be less likely to go for a shot block. So for your good shot blockers, you want to make sure that's up high. For your good defenders, you want to make sure the contest shot is up high. Same thing with the steals. So again, you can have great steal ratings or great shot block ratings, but if these things are low, that's going to sort of offset those numbers because they're not going to go for those scenarios as often. You know, the on-ball steal is going to be how often they're going to attempt to steal. The steal rating is going to be how good they are at actually stealing the ball. So they might be great at stealing the ball, but if you put this down at 0, they're really never going to try for steals, so it won't matter that they're good at stealing the ball. Same thing with the shot blocks. And the fouls, same thing. You will notice a difference. I did in one custom roster, I sort of try to tie it into stats and things like that and get these foul numbers up across the board so you'd see more fouls. So I generally 50 is going to be the guy, if he plays a full game, he's, going to get 2.5 fouls. So if you got a guy that's, these guys that, some guys, if you look at their fouls per 36 minutes, it's like 8 or 9 because they only play like 10 minutes and they get 4 fouls and they're constantly getting fouls. So guys like that, I put up really high at 80 or 90 or something like that. And you will see them picking up fouls more likely. There's not a lot of fouls in the game anyway in sim games. But if you do want to get more fouls in your games, do increase your foul tendencies across the board, and you'll see a slight increase. I mean, it's still not going to be like you would get in a real game, but it does have some level of impact, and you will see it more in the sim stats too. So anyway, hopefully there's something in there that you find helpful in your tendencies. If you're doing custom rosters or you're making players, really a lot of it's just trial and error. If you play 1 or 2 games, you're not going to see big differences. You could have, just the outlier game. So you really have to play several games when you're tweaking these tendencies to really see a difference. And you can see them if you do simulate just an entire season too. Like if you mess around with this dish to open man rating and you're simming an entire season, you will notice differences in the assist stats if you start making significant changes to that rating. Drive's another one too that's important, I should mention, because you will get guys who just drive. They're not very good shooters, and all they really can do is drive to the basket, like a Ben Simmons or something like that. If you do lower these shooting ratings, like the shot close, the shot under the basket. Well, maybe not shot under the basket because you want them if you want them going to the basket, you want that. But if you lower the mid-range and the 3-point, and then keep your shot close and your shot under the basket up pretty high or fairly high, and then if you bump up just the general drive rating higher, then you will notice guys going to the basket. Like put a guy at 0 for 3-point shooting and put him at 10 or something for mid-range and put him at 80 or 90 for drive. And you'll notice when that guy gets the ball, he's going to go to the basket a lot. So if you're trying to get a guy who isn't much of a shooter, like a Ben Simmons, of course he doesn't really shoot under the basket either, but if you're trying to get a guy who, just drove to the basket a lot, like maybe say a rookie Magic Johnson who didn't really take a lot of 3-point shots and didn't have a very good perimeter shot, I have his drive way high. And then, for like a rookie Magic Johnson, his 3-point shooting is at basically, almost 0, probably like 5. And his mid-range shot is at maybe 15. And you'll notice him in games, he'll just take it to the basket. And so same thing, like if you want, Jordan to, like a younger Jordan who didn't take a lot of 3-point shots to drive, especially with like the 83, 84 roster. Back then, teams were only taking 2.5 3-pointers a game for the entire team. So those guys, you probably want to start, make sure their 3-point ratings are down, their 3-point shot tendencies down. Still probably a decent mid-range one, but some of those guys that you want driving a lot, then if you put that drive rating higher, then you'll see a lot more drives. Now, that's not going to be the specific situations of spot up and off screen, but just in general, it's like, so if a guy gets the ball at the elbow and he's covered it's not going to be a spot up because he's covered, and he's not coming off a screen. So that's when this drive tendency is going to kick in. So basically everything but a spot up or an off screen sort of scenario, everything else is going to be dictated by this drive rating. And so these ratings here, you can really notice a difference with the players. And if you really want to get specific with it, you can kind of tweak these as you're testing, and you'll notice a difference if you adjust these ratings and then the ones in the jump shooting that correspond. So you'll really notice a difference in like how often you can get the guys to shoot, how often they'll take threes versus how often they'll drive, how passive they'll be versus how many times they're going to chuck up shots. So those tend to have a big difference. So anyway, hopefully there's something in there that you find useful. If you have any questions, let me know.